Podcasts give warnings about eating sounds.
Games, board games. We might be talking about all sorts of games, but we're not gonna shout. If you're a designer of video games, should you play board games? Which ones? What are their names? Should you play all sorts and everything? We'll discuss this after I finish singing. All sorts of games, that's what we're talking about. Hello, Joe, and everyone else, and we're not gonna shout. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you are. 10 a.m. ish UK time, time for Busy Beats and Board Game Bladder episode 836. And today we're talking about should designers play all sorts of games? Because there's a lot of, I mean, it depends how you define game, but like game shows, puzzles, contests, sports, like all of these can come under the collection of things we talk about as games. And yeah, why did you come up with this topic, Joe? Thank you for joining me.
It's lovely to be on, Bez. Thank you for having me. I think it's one of those obviously very loaded questions where we all know the answer is going to be yes, but the but the interesting stuff is in the why. So I teach on a game design course in Canterbury. I have done for the last 5 years. I was working in a video game studio before that, and I've always made games as a hobbyist, both video games and board games. Um, and the reason I came up with it as a topic is because I go on about it all of the time, and I suppose by having it on here, there's a little record of my standard arguments that I wheel out then, and I'm sure you'll have some that you can add to my armory of arguments
I
for
mean, maybe I
game
will
developers.
disagree. And hello, Josie. It is lovely to see you. Just for those who don't know, this is Josie Finch, who is one of the most delightful people and was with me at Dragon Meet on the weekend. And I have talked about Dragon Meet extensively, yesterday, where I did a full debrief and even got a bit teary over the fact that it's going to be possibly my last one ever. But I'm sure you're aware of that convention. And let's talk about some recent highlights, living life and seeing the sights, recent highlights, playing games and other delights. What have you been up to, Joe? What did you get up to over the weekend? Were you at Dragon Meet?
I was not at Dragon Meet, but it did have drag in the title. I went to a local cabaret night that was like a scratch night, and there were drag acts, there was burlesque, there were people doing funny songs. There was a very good shadow puppet show set to a montage of music. So that was very good, and I'm a big fan of. I think anyone involved in play or games should get involved in every type of play they possibly can, role play, whatever other kinds of play you can think of. I'm drawing a blank because it's too early on a Monday morning, but yeah, just going and seeing all of the talented people from my area down in Margate, Ramsgate, and doing silly or amazing things on a stage in a quick rotation was really fun. So yeah, that's the highlight
Yeah,
of
and
this weekend.
speaking of Margate and that sort of, you know, area, wait, is yeah, I'm trying to think. It is basically in that coastal, beachy Kent area, right?
Yeah.
It's basically where Johan Bryce Hodgson is, and so shouts out to friends of the show, Johan. And myself, after Dragon Meet, I decided I'd write a little post on the Dragon Meet convention page, which helped me process things, which was good. I got in touch with people. Met someone for a short date. I also held up my established boundaries with someone else and said, no, that's not cool. You don't get to do that. No, we're not meeting that cause. And I watched a really interesting Brazilian show. Have you heard of The Neighbor? It is a superhero show where someone becomes a superhero, like they're infused with these superpowers by an alien, and they just don't know what to do with it. So it's kind of like hey, I'm okay. Apparently, I'm kind of able to fly, but I'm really struggling to fly. So it's not like I'm able to do it well. But okay, I better keep it a secret, I guess. Okay, and now I guess I should try and save people if I can. And so after 7 episodes, finally the hero does something heroic. But for the most part, it's just this kind of totally low key thing of them getting to know their neighbors and about the relationships with everyone going on. It's completely ridiculous and I love it. Um, the other thing that I did is I want to share the fact that I woke up very early this morning in the wee hours, and then I actually wrote basically a first edition of a Kickstarter page. I need to add in my bank details and then I'll submit it, but I'm not going to launch it for a while because I've already got 3 outstanding Kickstarters. But once I've done those, this will be the next thing. Yes, this is drawn together, and I was just kind of buzzing, so I kind of had to do something that would just be writing a long thing. And I needed something that was more creative writing than the technical writing that I would do for writing instructions. So yeah, I did that, and that's all done now. And yeah, that is me. That is how I process my day after Dragon Meet. So Josie has some questions, and I will ask those in just a minute in the questionably quick question section. We will definitely bring that in. But first of all, Joe, what is a brilliant thing? Brilliant thing. What's the little thing which is brilliant?
A thing that is brilliant. Now, not everyone does this, but I'm aware that lots of people do. The little songs that you make up as you go throughout your day, that you might sing them to your cat or your dog. You might just be making some food and singing what you're doing. I think those are brilliant, and I think they deserve. I think everyone should record like a little mixtape of those songs on a dictaphone or something, and then give it to someone further down the line because you forget them, and there might be some masterpieces in there, you know.
I mean, have you followed your own advice? Have you ever taken a dictaphone and recorded all your wee songs?
Yeah, I've got the notes, the audio notes on my phone, and there's some very strange songs in there. I think it's just an important part of creative practice. I think everyone should record those songs.
I love it. And I think what we're getting at here is that even if something just feels like a throwaway thing and it's just the spur of a moment, that doesn't mean that it has less value, because the value of something is not in how much energy it took to make or in the struggle to make it, but it's in the thing itself. And sometimes an easy to make joyful thing can itself be lovely to listen to.
Yeah.
And so let me get. And hello, Dina. It is lovely to see you. Who says on game jams with video gamers, we often encourage them to make board games as well. So let's crack on with the questionably quick questions. Is the next section? It's not an interrogation. It's just the questionably quick questions section. So if you want to get questions about which and whatever, then get them in the next couple of minutes. But Joe, I didn't tell you that this was coming, but I think you're prepared for it. Books or podcasts?
Oh, podcasts.
What's the last one you listened to?
There's a podcast called Game Studies Study Buddies, where a couple of academics read texts from game studies and then talk about them for 2 hours. And it's what I do when I feel like I can't keep up with actually reading the field. I let someone else read it for me.
Nice. I'll definitely be checking that out. Josie asks, what is your favorite style of game to play? And is that the same as your favorite type of game to design?
In terms of tabletop games, I really like engine building. I'm probably a bit of a dull cube pusher. I like engine building. I like the idea of everyone's together to play a game, but it's not really directly aggressive. But yeah, I like all sorts of games, really. I like role-playing games as well, but I tend to like them when they're purely that. I think it's a difficult question to ask a designer, because I think one of the things we're going to get onto later is that any designer worth their salt plays lots of things, even if they don't like them. But yeah, I think generally speaking, I like to make something grow and make decisions that have long-term effects and get to see them pay off later down the line. I like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's really interesting because there's definitely a difference between a party game with a 2 minute atom that you could keep playing for half an hour or even hours, but fundamentally every 2 minutes it's the same thing, and the only thing that carries on is your score, versus uh, even a 30-minute game with a sense of growth, something where you build up stuff and there's more of an arc in terms of what you've established on the board.
Mm.
Um, Hello, Heather. It's lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. Heather asks, who's your Cluedo character going to be?
Do I have to be an existing one, or is this like workshop a new Cluedo character?
That sounds more exciting. Let's go with that. Otherwise, I
Um,
think you'd be Colonel Mustard because of
yeah,
the.
that's fair enough. Let's go with Reverend Beige.
Reverend Brave.
Yeah,
Like, there's already Reverend Green. I
there
mean,
is.
we've have we got all the titles? I mean, we could. We've got definite. We've got Professor, right? Have we got Doctor? Like, could you be Lord Beige or um the Beige Boy? Just,
Archduke Chartreuse or something. I don't know.
I like it.
It's a
And
good
I'll
question.
close off the questions, and no more questions, please. Josie asks, your favorite reindeer?
I think Blitzen, just because they have quite an aggressive sounding name, which doesn't fit with a reindeer, so they kind of stand out to me
Come
for some
on,
reason.
Blitzens are going at supersonic speeds around the
Yeah.
world, living those things. Josie says you could have Reverend Rivalry. What's your favorite holiday food?
Oh, that's really difficult. I had a couple of years where I was vegan, so I didn't eat any turkey. I think it's just roast vegetables. I'm a roast parsnip lover. I know that they're a
Parsnips. Parsnips are
divisive
where it's at.
vegetable.
They are so
Yeah,
underrated. People don't understand that they are the best bits on the plate.
yeah. If you overcook them, you can use them as a chisel as well. You can climb up things.
I mean, that would be a shame of the parsnips. Um, And as always, I want to remind people that please do continue commenting, asking questions. This is a whole font like follow thing. And the reason that I do this live is for that interaction, but we are going to get a little bit more on topic. Dina, before we leave this, says, for me, it's all about the roasted carrots. Josie just wants to celebrate the roasted vegetables generally. For myself, it would be the stuffing as well as the parsnips. But getting to the main topic, Josie had a question straight off the bat. On your course, what's the difference you've seen in designers who only stick to one media format of games in their own playing generally?
It's such a big question. I mean, on a university course, you get such a diversity of intake. You get some people who will come to it having never done anything before. They've never made a board game. They've never used a game engine. And partly that's because games don't really exist as a discrete subject in school. So if someone has made a game in school, then it's usually in a computing class, and they do it purely to make computing seem fun, which is not really what game design is about. Whether you're making your cards for your board game on a computer, or you're making a game that runs on a computer, game design is not computing. So I think what we tend to see is if someone has played more types of games, on different systems and more genres of games, they have a better understanding of the big abstract concepts. So, we in board games, we have like componentry, and we have things that you're doing with the components, like drawing a card, or, and the same with a video game, moving a joystick, moving a character around. But then we have these more abstract concepts, like, say, pushing your luck, or building an engine, or I split, you choose. All of these things that we talk about in board games are quite abstract, and you don't get them just from playing one board game. You get them from playing lots and seeing patterns. So I think it's always going to make someone a better designer to have played lots of different things. In terms of what we see on the course, I couldn't really, people are so variable that I wouldn't be able to go, this type of student does this and this type of student does that. But there is definitely a global help to them if they've played board games. But as probably...
Oh, you've muted yourself accidentally. I mean, you're unmuted again.
There we go. I knocked on my mic and it came unplugged. There we go.
Back. So it sounds like even though I'm going to try and challenge what you're saying, even though you're telling people to play different kinds of games, it sounds like on an empirical level, you've not actually noticed a real market difference between designers who've done that before university and people who've only played one type of thing. That the difference between that is less than all the variances in their general upbringing and their differences as individual humans.
I think the biggest difference, really, it's hard to say what thing is productive of the other thing, but the biggest difference is to do with curiosity. And you will find that someone who is sort of up for everything and tries different things out is just generally does better in a creative field, full stop. And it's hard to, put the cart before the horse and say one thing is generative of the other, but there is always a link there. So, I mean, if you took another medium, for example, if you took music, you might have someone who only plays jazz music, and that seems to be all they're interested in producing. But the jazz musician who listens to heavy metal and listens to opera and stuff is probably doing more interesting things with jazz music. And it's very hard to map that on in an empirical way, because you're talking about people's whole lives and all of the richness involved in an individual life. But I think that at the core, you've got those much more soft attributes of someone being curious and someone being outgoing and about trying things out and stuff like that. And it's hard to say whether it's actually the gaming that is doing the work or if it's that attribute of being open-minded and trying out new things.
Yeah, that's a very fair point, and I appreciate you being upfront. That's, correlation does not, of course, necessarily mean that there's causation, but it might help to keep that alive. Because if at some point you say, well, I'm going to start just focusing because maybe I'm making a lot more party style card games. If I were to say, okay, I'm just going to focus on playing party card games, sure, it's useful for me to be aware of what's out there, but then that's going to maybe stifle my curiosity and slow down the rate at which I get other inspiration. And but there are a couple of other things that I want to ask you. Firstly, how important is it to actually play these things? Because you can learn about games, whether by reading the rules or by watching videos of them being played, or by reading something like Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, there are lots of games that I feel like I have a reasonably deep knowledge of that I have never played because of that, because of podcasts, books, and so on. I think you do have to play something in the genre for all of those descriptions to make sense. When someone says, "Oh, this is like this, but with a twist," if you don't have that initial reference point, then it's quite difficult. Do we need to actually play? I think to a degree, yeah. And I think the point you just made about when you are focusing on making a particular type of thing, you might narrow down into that genre and then come back out of it later. And one of the reasons I think it's important to do that, and you've made so many sort of party type games, and I imagine, I'm just guessing here, but I would imagine there's a degree of imagining the sort of situation you want to cause with people and then working back from that. There's a Bill Bailey joke where he says, "When I'm writing comedy, I imagine a laugh and work backwards." So it's like that kind of thing of, and we see it with certain video games. There are a couple of really good cooperative video games where there's one called Overcooked, where you're running around a little kitchen and it ends up with everyone shouting at each other, and it's fantastic. And it's that same thing of, okay, I want to create a situation where people are working together, they're laughing, they are shouting at each other, or there's some particular type of social thing going on. And in the best, the easiest way to do that is to look at other games that do it and try and work out how they've achieved it. And again, you can apply these principles to any media. If you were making films, what bits of films made me cry? Okay, I'm going to reverse engineer that, and kind of go from there. So I think we do need to play stuff to have an awareness of how the things work. But often, watching other people play things is valid. Hearing other people describe things is valid. I listen to pretty much every episode of the Shut Up and Sit Down podcast, and I feel like there are so many games that they talk about repeatedly on there that I feel like they've got a mythology in my head of Cosmic Encounter is this type of game, and if I wanted to know about this type of game, I'd go and play that now. But that's what critics are for, aren't they? Really, it's to point us towards things, and then if we want to go and dive in, we know what's there. But also, it's not realistic to expect everyone who makes stuff to be able to play every single thing and have access to dozens and
it would
dozens
be
of things
literally impossible to do that, because I would hypothesize that in order to just keep up with the number of games that are being made in one day would take you more than 24 hours. I'm basing that on absolutely nothing other than a gut feeling, but I would be surprised if that weren't true. The same way that there's more than, like, it was, I think, back in 2012-ish, that I realized on this one website there was more than 24 hours of music being uploaded every day. And I was like, wow, it's ridiculous. And this was by a massive collaboration of like all independent music people just uploading whatever. And obviously you've got people who have their own fans. But if you want to so someone made a script that you could go through literally everything in the upload order. And I was like, wow, that just really brought home, to me at least, that the modern utility, the modern skill that the modern person really needs is curation, kind of working out how to do this and choose to not do the other thing. And I just want to, by the way, say that for the record, I do agree that it's important to play the things, to experience the things, to play all the other things. But as always, I'm going to try and have an interesting conversation, because otherwise it's boring. Manuel says, I think your gut feeling is right. A few years ago, there were over 1,000 games released at Essen on a weekend. Yeah, but that's a special date. Come on. I mean, there's probably less than 10,000 games released total in a year, board games wise. I mean, it might be close, but I reckon, you can't just take that one weekend and extrapolate from that. Now, let's accept that it might be useful, but why? Why is this something that you're saying, hey, people, do this? What's the utility?
So there's a very specific answer to do with video games, and it's a bit dull, but I'll take you through it anyway. So when we teach people to make video games, there are a couple of different tools you can use, a couple of different game engines. Unity and Unreal will be the ones people will have heard about, but they have a very strong bias towards 3D games and particular types of games. And a lot of the tutorials you can find are about action games. So they kind of steer you towards making sorts of things by the pure nature of the tool. So there are a lot of kind of game features that if you play video games and you play big AAA video games, GTA, Fallout, any of those types of things, there are so many features in them that are not the sort of thing you can just get stuck in and make straight away. So often I'll find new game students they say, I want my game to have crafting in, and I want it to have this massive map, and I want it to have like you collect all of these objects and they go in an inventory and all of these things. And at a hypothetical level, you can write that design document and say, yeah, I've designed a game, but actually making them in an engine, if you're trying to make something like an inventory system from scratch, that might take you a couple of months the first time you do it. And it hasn't added anything to your game, because then you need to make all the items to make it worth having an inventory in the first place. So there are entire genres of game that I think it is better to practice developing in an analog sense first. So if you take, for example, things like Civilization, which is what's called a 4X video game, like a big grand strategy game,
Mm-mm.
has a board game equivalent, right? And I think there was a board game called Civilization that predates the old 80s Civilization video game as well. If you want to make games that are about long-term thinking and strategy and resource management and these types of things, those things are actually quite difficult to kind of program and build in a video game engine if you have no prior experience. So someone who's coming to video games and the video games they play are of that nature and they want to make something like that, it's actually going to be a lot easier for them to start with a board game. And the same with anything like a Pokemon game. We have game engines like RPG Maker, which is built for that kind of turn-based old Japanese style role-playing game, and you can use that engine. But again, you might just prototype the whole game with cards. The other thing that's really good about and Manuel's just kind of supporting the idea of analog prototyping there, and it happens in big game studios as well. And you can see the video games that could quite easily have started from a board game prototype, things like XCOM, things that literally just look like a board game on a computer. And there's the other aspect of when you're first learning to program, you have to think about what are called data structures. So, every object in a game has a bunch of variables in it. It has information in it that causes it to function how it would and interact with different scripts in the code and so on. And the thing about making a board game is you have to do exactly that same thing of structuring information and managing information, but you have to do it in a very human, legible way, and you have to do it in a way that there's not so much there that humans can't pass it. And one of the early tasks
That's
after
kind of almost like the difference between the overarching game design and then the card design,
yes,
or
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
the tile design for a tiling game. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things we often do quite early on is take a card from something like Magic the Gathering and just break down the information hierarchy of the card and then talk about it in terms of computer science. Like, what are the variables on here? How do keywords function? And then you can even look at the graphic design and look at how is the graphic design of this card being used to give various pieces of those information. So kind of to take the variables that are in the game and pump them up to the player's eyes so that they can read all of these things, not just in text, but also through iconography. And a game like Magic is really interesting because you can see how that's changed over time. And obviously, they've still got the same backs of the cards that they've always had, but certain things about the layout of the card itself have changed over time because it's kind of easier to
But
take
only
the
in a
information.
very subtle way. I mean, Future Sight, if you look at that set where they imagined this is what it could look like in a far-flung future, where they put all the mana symbols to the left as well as the type of card it is, so you can sort of fan out the card, was really interesting. But then they're never going to really redesign it to that level, are they? Because of the inertia.
Yeah. But yeah, so I think there's a couple of arguments there. One is that analog game design forces you to think about all of the things you need to think about when you're programming a game into a computer. And a lot of the things that people struggle with when they're starting to program as a video game developer are to do with things of that nature. So they will often sit down and think, oh, this computer language is really hard to learn. That's what I'm struggling with. But often it's that they haven't really identified what they're asking the game engine to do in the first place. Computers do what you tell them to do. And if it does something weird, it's because you think you've told it to do one thing and you've actually told it to do another thing. And often when you go and sit down with a student and they say, I'm stuck, and you say, well, what are you trying to do? And they don't know. So, that kind of doing analog design first can really help with that decision making of like, right, this is a unit and this is the information that the unit needs in order to exist in the game and be able to interact with the other stuff in the game. It's that kind of top level abstract design thinking.
And I love the quote, board games are code that runs on people. I love that. It makes a lot of sense what you're, pardon me, what you're saying, that fundamentally design is different to coding, even though, people talk about I'm a game developer when they're talking about programming, and development in board game world is very different to what it means in the video game world. But that rules design is the heart of game design, and coming to it from a board game perspective allows you to get right to the heart of what that is and the ramifications of these rules, thinking of how are these rules going to affect the player experience, which is the heart of it. And it makes sense to strip back and go to something simpler. I remember actually years ago, I made some games for a traditional deck of playing cards. I made a few because I'd read somewhere on the internet, if you want to be a game designer, then what you should do is, I mean, I don't think it was presented as you must do this, but just here's a good idea to make some games for decks of playing cards. You don't have to worry about prototyping, you don't have to make anything. So that's even a step simpler than a board game because you don't have to worry about inventing a new, graphic design system or worrying about the cards layouts or anything. It's just, hey, this is what I've got. Now, what can I do with this? Because there's so much that could be done and still hasn't been done. And that's almost a step further for, hey, if you fancy making board games, it's still worth going and starting off with a game system, whether that's traditional playing cards or, obviously, I'm biased, make a game for the L deck. And there's a contest every year that finishes on 31st of July. But is there a opposite? For board gamers, is it useful to play video games? And is it useful to delve into the completely different genres of sports, of role playing games and LARPs, of quizzes? And if so, why?
I think that's a really good question. But I think one of the things about the different gaming communities is, I think a lot of the time I will meet 18, 19-year-old students that are coming into university, and their experience of playing tabletop games is very, very limited. And it is because a lot of what we think of board games is kind of a luxury hobby. And you might meet loads of people that have played Exploding Kittens or Cards Against Humanity or something like that, or maybe they've played a CCG because the economics of a CCG sort of work with pocket money and being a teenager in a way that buying a £50 game at a time doesn't work. Um, and what that means for accessibility in board game spaces is if you're trying to make something that's kind of an entry level game, it makes sense to kind of get an understanding of the games people have played before. And a lot of those games will be video games, right? So what conventions can I take from the most kind of well-known video games for my board game if I want it to be accessible to an audience of people that maybe don't normally play board games? I think there's kind of that aspect to it.
Mhm.
And I think that doesn't just apply to games. I think that applies across the board. So there's a brilliant video game that came out a couple of years ago called Reigns. Have you heard of this? And it uses like the Tinder interface. So you're a monarch ruling a kingdom, and it brings cards up on a screen, computer screen, but ideally a mobile, and then you swipe them left or right to make decisions, and that's the entire game. So it's taking the interface from Tinder, from a dating app, and putting it in this new context. And that's both kind of thematically quite funny, but it's also gives you an entry point where it doesn't care, if you've played another game, the kind of the reference for how you interact with this thing is from somewhere else in the world. Um, so yeah, I think kind of looking at if you're making tabletop games, looking at video games for an understanding of what other objects have people interacted with in the world that I can make my
Mhm.
thing like, so that people will have that thing to kind of attach to that they'll understand. It's they're in video game studies. We got this term mimesis that means like when something copies another thing. And there's a brilliant book, stretching time. There's a brilliant book called The Casual Revolution by Jesper Juhl, and it talks about how when things like Guitar Hero and Wii Bowling came out, the reason they were so popular is because they looked like something that people who didn't play games were familiar with. You didn't
Yes.
have that level of abstraction of pressing the buttons and then it does something unrelated on the screen. You're literally bowling the ball or whatever. And I think, a lot of the time we can be looking at what other activities do people do in their lives that I can put into my game as a form of interaction that people understand.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Although, again, um, that's kind of advocating, hey, don't only spend all your time doing this one thing. It's
Mm.
almost saying, hey, spend your time watching Brazilian,
Yeah.
shows or, listening to music and documentaries and musicals. And, all of these are good. Is there really an added utility of us going and exploring a quiz, for example, and
Mm.
maybe even designing a quiz compared to trying to write a song?
I think creativity is all about it's about kind of having a T-shaped skill set. Have you heard this phrase before? Where it's
I
the idea of
haven't. Please explain it.
having a very broad generalist knowledge of lots of things, and then having a narrow, deep knowledge of like the
Mm-mm-mm.
particular area you're working with. And what that enables you to do is when you're doing that deep knowledge of like whatever you're making, party games, tabletop role playing games, arcade video games, you know all of the specifics of what works there. But if you don't have that broad knowledge, then you don't have anything interesting to bring in and go, okay, no one's ever made an arcade game about squids, whatever it is. The other things in life that you're interested in form part of that wide top of the T. And the wide top of the T is also the thing that gives you the ability to communicate with other people. Because, like, I know that you a lot of your games you're kind of working as a solo unit, but if someone is a game designer and they have to communicate with the graphic designer or the artist, and they have to be able to talk about art stuff. If they don't have that top thing, so I don't think it's possible to waste your own time as a creative person going and doing other
Mm.
things because, like, particularly people who practice a couple of things. Like I make games and I make music as well, and I can kind of see where there are links between how certain things
Mm-mm-mm.
work, and some of those things are quite abstract and boring. um, I think when it comes to like hard skills like drawing or coding or writing, those are the things where you do need to just spend hours doing it because some of it's muscle memory and building up instinct, and you do need to like devote an amount of time to that deep that neck of the T or the trunk or whatever you want to call it. But I don't think we ever lose anything by going and watching a Brazilian superhero show or just sitting down at a piano and writing a song when it's not really your thing, because it's all brain exercise of some kind.
Yeah, that makes lots of sense. And I'm sorry if I seem distracted. Just my computer battery seems to not be working properly, but hopefully it can stay alive. Um, you've talked about it sounds like there aren't really key games to play, but you're saying that we need to play something from all the different genres. That it's useful if we understand all the different mechanisms and at least a key example. Like we don't need to understand every single way that I split you
Mm.
choose can operate, but we understand broadly what I split you choose means and what it brings to a game. Is
Yeah.
that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think often, if you're a designer or you're working with other people and you're using things like genre names to communicate, I'll often say, so my year 3 students have just finished doing the documentation and the prototyping for their game they're going to spend most of the year on. There's an example of a pitch that we get students to do right at the start of the year. Um, and I often say, if you're going to use a genre title or something like that, then explain what you mean, or even better, just explain what you mean in the first place. So we get certain words like deck building. That's a common one. What does that mean? And lots of people will still think you're talking about a deck construction game where you make a deck in between matches. So is there any value in using the term deck building then, or do you just use a sentence to describe what you're talking about? So I think it's really important for people to play the types of games they're going to make so that they're not kind of misusing language and miscommunicating to people what it is. We get genre terms that are really buzzwordy. So in video games, roguelike at the moment. Now, there are
Mm-mm-mm.
so many conventions that go into what we would define as a roguelike, but sometimes people say roguelike and they just mean it has randomized levels, or they mean when you die, you go back to the start, and they don't actually mean the full genre. So a lot of the time, sort of kind of playing the things, getting a sense of what these terms mean.
And of
Um,
course, all
but
of these things are so blurry, and in the same way that in music, it's like, okay, what is metal? What is heavy metal? What is new metal? And it's like, then we've got roguelike, and then we've got roguelite, and all the, yeah,
Diet
it's,
Diet Roguelite, Rogue Zero, Rogue Max, Cherry Rogue.
It is
So yeah,
really
I don't think.
interesting for sure to bring in things. And to be fair, I do think that probably within. I've said recently that I think there are broadly two types of agency. There's one type of agency which is about testing skills, and that might be within a party game, you're testing the skill of can you imagine what the judge will pick, or can you t- it might be the skill of reaction based, or the skill of observation, or the skill of making a noise that other people can interpret, whatever, or indeed mathematical strategies. But there's the other side, which is the self expressive side. And sure, some games can do both, but maybe not both within one aspect. And it feels like it's almost more important to try things that are trying to elicit a similar experience, that play with a similar kind of agency, rather than things that are using similar mechanisms necessarily. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're totally right, and I know it can sound kind of airy fairy to talk about experience design and that thing we started off on of like imagining the people interacting with the thing, what's going on with them, what emotion are they having, and then working back from that. But that is, I think that's all creativity. If you wanted to, you would do it with food, you would do it with music, you sort of have interactions with things in the world, you kind of store those emotions. And then if you're an analytical, creative person, you're able to take that apart and build the toolkit to then create those things. And I think, yeah, the entry level thing we often do is just grab the stuff we like and we go, oh, I like cards and I like monsters, and we just jam it together. And that's how everyone starts, really. It's it's standard, and I wouldn't discourage people from doing that. But at some point, you have to start to get that sort of more abstract, higher level knowledge of like you say, you're kind of creating this distinction between types of agency. That's such an abstract way of thinking about it. But I think being able to understand things at that level is what most designers should be aiming for. And if they're reading the right things and thinking about design in a thoughtful way, I think they usually will end up there.
And just as a side note, if anyone's confused by what roguelite means, Manuel has a very lovely definition, uses some aspects of roguelikes, normally just randomized level layouts and sometimes the permadeath. And the other question that I wanted to say, yeah, we've touched upon this already, but is there a limit to utility in the styles of games? Is there you when you talk about this deep tea, how do we define that? Are we saying, okay, I want to make, let's say I want to make party games. I mean, as a person, for the record, I want to make all sorts of games, and I hope that within the next 2, 3 years, there will be many games that people will be surprised. Oh, that doesn't feel like a Bez game. But assuming you want to make party games, are you going? Should you be focusing on game party games regardless of whether it's digital or analog, or should you be focusing on games within that same medium, if you're not like the same format?
I would always encourage people to kind of be diverse in what they take in and put in their brain. But at the same time, I don't, having looked at other people's careers, I don't think you could be prescriptive about this. I think you get creatives that just focus very narrowly on one thing and are the best at that. And then you get creatives who, like myself, I'm very driven by novelty, and I will do one thing. And then, like, the thing that attracts me to making things is usually making it as a process of working out how it works, and then the staying around and polishing it part, not so much. So you do that experiment, you find out how something works, and then maybe you want to move on to something totally other. Now you can get all sorts of guides that are like, here's how you should produce a game, here's how you should be creative in general. But to some degree, you have to work with your own psychology and what works for you. So, for
Because I
example,
mean, you've got the Uwe Rosenberg approach, where sure they started off with Bonanza and whatnot,
yeah,
and then a Grit Club, but then eventually they settled on a Face for Odin, Patchwork, and all of
hmm
these games that use polyominoes.
yeah,
And this is like what they're really focusing on. It's almost like Picasso going through their
yeah.
blue period.
Yeah, I have this almost like comedy imagining of Uwe Rosenberg's house just being all of these polyonymo furnishings and like things on the walls and like um but like the doctrine of like fail fast prototyping. So if anyone in the chat's unfamiliar with this, it's the idea that you should never beautify your prototype because you're going to have to change it really soon, and the more time you spend making it nice, the more reluctant you'll be to change it when you need to change it. And that's like a very common thing in game design books and so on. But
Mm-mm.
I'm the sort of person where I need to spend a little bit of time on the mechanics and workings of the game, and then when I get tired of that, I need to spend some time imagining the theme and the art style and stuff, even if I'm not going to be the artist, because that helps me to imagine the place I'm trying to go with it. And if I don't take that time to, polish a turd basically and beautify something prematurely, then I lose interest. So
Mm-mm.
you can have these kind of like prescriptive of, oh, this is how you should do something, but everyone's going to have their own individual psychology that leans in towards hyper focusing on one thing, like the Uwe Rosenberg way, or being much more novelty seeking. So I think the opposite of that would be like Vlada Chvátil. So
Mm-mm.
making Mage Knight and making code names, and if you look at that designer's catalog of games, if you look at Vlada's games, it's like, were these made by the same person? And it's that same thing if you were saying you were aspiring to hopefully having some things come out where people go, is this Bez? Um, it's the kind of Frank Zappa approach to making games of how can I confuse people and put them on the back foot by always making something different and not having a clear authorship of the sort of thing I make. Um, so yeah, I think there are loads of design books that will have a very prescriptive here is how you should do things, but so much of being making stuff, making good stuff, but also just being happy enough in doing what you're doing to want to carry on doing it is to do with knowing yourself and knowing where you sit on that kind of novelty versus specificity kind of thing, and all of that, I think.
I think this is a really useful thing to remember. And no, J Fool's Guards, you're totally welcome to listen in and lurk. That's totally fine. And Manuel says, I bet Uwe Rosenberg grows vegetables somewhere in the house. I think that everything we've said today, all of these rules are to be broken. I mean, on Mastodon, I asked people, are there rules for game titles? I mean, I think that one rule is probably try to keep it to less than five syllables or less is a good rule, which, is a rule that I've broken many times, I will admit. Another good rule will probably be to try and have a unique combination of words, which again is a rule that sadly I have broken. And, a game about wee whimsical creatures and trying to identify them after some mixed noises is nice because wee whimsical creatures, people can Google just that and hopefully find it, or indeed cute comical creatures. But for a game about quickly grabbing creatures that are totally different and counting your turnips, sure, if you look up turnips on Board Game Geek, you'll probably find it. But if you look up that's going to be forgettable. And there's all sorts of rules that you've got to think about why are you doing this? What matters for this thing? And there's all these we are not robots. Whatever works for you is the way to do things. And if spending all of your time focusing on video games and understanding that is what works for you, then go for it. If what works for you is playing fewer games and just listening a lot more, then do that. And if what works for you is, going to the theater and imagining that the director is playing a game with the actors on stage and trying to translate that into, game mechanics and having this high level flights of fancy and how you might transcribe that into a board game or indeed a video game, then do that. And I think that we can say, yeah, all else being equal, if you haven't played a variety of games, you might be missing out. But there are no absolutes because humans are all different. Is there anything you would like to say about this topic?
Um, Not really. I think we've been talking about some really broad stuff to do with people and creativity, and that's great because it's one of my favorite topics. And a lot of the people that I know that are freelance creatives who do stuff like art or comic books or whatever full time and are able to make a living out of it. They don't just do one thing; they do a couple of things, and they have these like portfolio careers. One thing I would suggest to anyone who's kind of watching, who is a kind of creative person or is sort of setting out on that kind of journey, is the thing that you need to do that you don't do is usually the thing that you most need to do. And there'll be a thing. It might be rewriting your rules. It might be going and meeting up with that playtesting group and actually getting your game in front of people. There will be a thing that you really avoid doing because you're like, oh, I'm not sociable enough to do that, or I'm not good enough with numbers to do that spreadsheeting task. And it's that scary thing in the corner of your design process is nearly always the thing that is going to boost you the furthest if you just sort of charge into it one day this week and spend a day with it. And that's kind of the most general advice I can give to anyone doing anything creative, is sort of like, as every so often you have to acknowledge what that scary thing is that you don't want to do, and then just dedicate a day to it and go and
I think this is a really nice
dust.
place to remember that it's better to do a thing badly than to not do it and just get stuck in, because the way you get better at these things is to do it over and over. And sure, sometimes there are things that you can do more or less of. If you realize, hey, I'm better at the high level thinking and I'm less good at the balancing, that's totally okay. I mean, sure, it might be put into one bucket in, game design in a video game sense, but it's still different skills. I mean, we can still separate, the balancing and from the high level thinking. And but if you want to get good at it, then the way to do that is to do it over and over, and it will become less scary eventually. Yes, 100%. I agree. It's a solid advice. And Manuel just says not every game needs balancing at all. I guess that could be true if it's very interactive with players, like Cosmic Encounter, for example, where. But that's a topic for another day. Um, I feel like I've asked you a lot of questions, Joe, and would you like to ask me a question? Question of the day, question of the day. Here's a little question before we go on our way. So, question for me and potentially anyone watching. Question of the day, question of the day. Here's a little question before we go on our way.
Because sort of all questioned out. What vegetables do you think Uwe Rosenberg grows in this house?
Oh, honestly, um, if we're looking culinary vegetables, like I would say tomatoes, because that's the most probable one. I think that's if we're thinking, okay, it's actual things that are underground. Okay, then we're assuming that it's in a garden, unless, I mean, it's possible to have an indoor garden, although that would be really weird. Like your greenhouse is kind of combined with your house somewhere. I don't know what's going on there. But yeah, if there's say, a small garden outside or an allotment, I'm going to say, courgettes. I think that, yeah, I'm going to go with those are my two choices. Emmanuel says beans, of course, with bonanza. Of course, it would be beans. J. Folsgard says tomatoes. Do you think he has a greenhouse? What does everyone else think? That's a good question for everyone to answer. If Uwe Rosenberg grows vegetables, firstly, do you think Uwe Rosenberg does actually grow vegetables? Because, in my opinion, the answer, in all honesty, is probably no. But I don't know. But if they did, what vegetables do you think they would grow? And I'm sticking with. Actually, I'm going to. Beans is really tempting to change to. But I'm sticking with tomatoes and courgettes if we're placing bets.
I think sort of gourds grown in molds so that they take on tetraamino type forms. But I think you could do that with a couple of different things. I'm not
Or
that
you can do that with
up on.
anything. I watched a short video about it yesterday. It was like a 10-minute thing where they've got like apples and pears and watermelons and everything, where it's really fancy molds that you put on when they're young and then they grow to perfectly fit this thing. I think it's better with stuff that's a bit hard on the outside. I I didn't see any soft things like cherries or tomatoes in retrospect. But yeah, at this point, over to you. What are you up to? You can share botany if you want to. I am going to get my bank details just to get this Kickstarter finalized by Kickstarter so I can send it for review because that I really appreciate, honestly, this Board Game Geek thread. I don't know if you've seen it, the worst Kickstarter, because until I saw that, I was like, oh, I need to make all my Kickstarters look really, really good. And that reminds me that, okay, to get it accepted by Kickstarter, this is the lower level. And, after a few hours of work, I've already surpassed that. So it's like, yeah, they should accept this and I don't need to be scared of it. You know what I mean? And it's like just a reminder that the bottom level is probably lower than you think. And other than that, I will probably do some rules writing. I've got a lot of emails to write. I've got some things to post off. That would all be good. And I'm going to try and attack as many of those tasks as I can. Also, might have a bit of curry and rice, tin curry. How about everyone else? What are you up to? Is there something you need to do, something you want to do, something that you want to share? Please do. I promise I care. Joe.
I was just watching the chat. I might also have some curry and rice. But mostly I'll be checking in on my students. So I have days when I go into class and days when I'm working from home doing administrative stuff. So I'm going to be just doing lots of emailing today and eating curry.
Nice. Well, let's me, as always, recap and wrap up before we finish up. We talked about a good amount of stuff. We talked about drag acts and shadow puppets and Brazilian TV shows and processing things by writing a Facebook post and waking up early and making a Kickstarter page. If I pop that on the chat, there we go. That's the Kickstarter page for Drawn Together. I'm thinking of, I know this is probably not recommended, but I'm going to call it hashtag Drawn Together Game as the actual name of the game, because when people finish the game, the idea is that they post on social media, what do you think this looks like? Hashtag Drawn Together Game. And then people can, if they want to give opinions on other people's finished pieces, then they can chime in. And actually, out of curiosity, what do you think this looks like? Ghost or tree? Um, hashtag or hashtag asks J Guard. Oh, I'm glad you get it. But yes, Joe, you need to unmute yourself. Um, Ghost or tree?
I'm getting a lot more tree energy from that, but most of the ghosts I've seen don't have those, you know.
Yeah, so we're saying that that's definitely tree. What about this one? Ghost or tree?
That's almost certainly a ghost.
Yeah, I would agree. And this is like, I think one of them I played Ghost versus Tree, and in both of them I was Ghost. So the top one I played against one person, and in the bottom one I played as Ghost against their partner. And you can tell that their partner, um, I'll just say that Charlie Paul is a lot more artistic than Alan Paul, and leave
Mm.
it at that. And I don't think that Alan's going to be too bothered by me saying that. And yeah, it's a game about aesthetics. Anyway, so we talked about game study buddies, about engine building, about reindeers, about Christmas vegetables, about saying that there's all sorts of students. Everyone's got their own personal story. We talked about the holistic viewpoints, about thinking about these terms and being able to communicate with other people, understanding the ramifications of things and seeing them in their purer forms. In a board game, for sure, there is the purity of focusing on those rules in non digital games. It shows clearly the considerations that you need to make, and then you don't need to worry about the programming and all those things that you need to get into. But again, more pure than making a board game where you need to think about making a board or okay, how do I make these tiles? Rather than having to do that physical construction, make a game with playing cards or a game system like the L deck. We talked about curating your curiosity, fostering that, keeping it alive, and understanding what people understand, being inspired by Tinder in the access of reigns. We talked about the T shaped knowledge base where you've got this broad knowledge where you can pull on what other people might be aware of, but also what people might be unaware of to have something fresh in your game, but also having the deep, deep, deep understanding of the art form in which you're working. But ultimately, we did say that we are individuals and it's important to know yourself because there are no absolutes. Is there anything that I missed? As always, if you want to check me out, I am Stuff by Bez everywhere. Stuffbybez.com/streams is where you can check out my future calendar. Tomorrow, I am meeting a new friend from Thailand, Faranak Khan Mohammadi, and I'm looking forward to chatting with Faranak for the first time. And this is someone that, when I travel to Bangkok, we might actually meet up and hang out and play games, which will be nice. Um, so we're just going to have a chat, maybe talk a little bit about teaching, talking about the board games that they enjoy. As always, we've got Jessica Mederingham on Wednesday. We've got Simon Lavender on Thursday. Friday will be a very quick show. Michael Botterill on Saturday talking a bit more about demoing. And if you want to check out Joe Baxter-Webb, then where would you like to be found?
So there's a link on the screen for a site called ludogogical.com, which is a silly portmanteau of play and pedagogy. And this is a site where I kind of blog about game design, teaching game design. It's gone off the boil a bit now, but I've been trying to write 100-word game reviews of things that I play because that's a really nice writing exercise. And Ludogogical is also my Twitter handle, but there I'm mostly complaining and talking nonsense. So the website might be more useful to you if you're interested in some of the things we spoke about today.
Well, I want to say to everyone out there, please do share, spread the word, and thank you everyone for the lovely comments and questions along the way. It has been an absolute delight. And most importantly, Joe, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Bez. It's been lovely.
I, I would like to bid everyone adieu, and for now, bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Do do do. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye bye, everyone.